What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 13.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL Week 13. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So at the quarterback position, I'm going to start Taysom Hill from the New Orleans Saints playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Taysom Hill, he scored 19 and 25 fantasy points in the first 2 games as the starting quarterback. He had 10 rush attempts in both of those games, and he's projected at 19.9 fantasy points here in Week 13. So Vegas thinks there's going to be 46 points scored in this game, and they have the Saints favored by 3. This is a fantastic matchup, and we've seen that Taysom Hill has some nice fantasy football upside with rushing touchdowns. So I'm going to start Taysom Hill here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, what quarterback are we going to sit in Week 13? I'm going to sit Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions playing the Chicago Bears, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has averaged 17.9 fantasy points per game on the season, but he only scored 17 and 8 fantasy points in the last 2 games, projected at 17.7 fantasy points here in Week 13. He just hasn't had the same upside since the injury to Kenny Golladay. Now he's facing a tough Chicago Bears defense in what should be a low-scoring game. So I'm going to sit Matthew Stafford here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start Wayne Gallman from the New York Giants playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Wayne Gallman, although he's only averaged 9.6 fantasy points per game on the season, take a look at his last 3 games. He scored 18, 19, and 15 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 24, 18, and 14 rush attempts. So his volume's going up. He even got 5 pass targets last game. He's projected at 12.5 fantasy points here in Week 13. Great matchup here. Tons of volume. Getting the goal line carries. He's been productive. I think that momentum continues here versus the Seahawks. So I'm going to start Wayne Gallman here versus the Seattle Seahawks. Okay, what running back are we going to sit in Week 13? I'm going to sit Duke Johnson from the Houston Texans playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have the 3rd best defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Duke Johnson has averaged 7.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.4 rush attempts per game and 3 pass targets per game. His rushing volume hasn't even gone up that much as the starting running back. He only got 9 and 10 rush attempts in the last 2 games, although he also got 4 and 5 pass targets, scoring 17 fantasy points last week but just 7 and 5 in the 2 previous weeks before that. He's projected at 13.5 fantasy points here in week 13, but he's got a tough matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts. I think those rush attempts are way too low for me to consider starting Duke Johnson, so I'm going to sit Duke Johnson here versus the Indianapolis Colts.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. What wide receiver are we going to start in week 13? I'm going to start Devontae Parker from the Miami Dolphins playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 9th worst defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Devontae Parker has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.2 pass targets per game. Take a look at his last 2 games. He scored 23 and 18 fantasy points off of 14 and 9 pass targets. He's projected at 14.7 fantasy points here in week 13. And although Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game, only 41.5 points scored in this game. They have the Miami Dolphins favored by 11. It's a great matchup. He's getting a ton of pass targets. So I'm going to start Devontae Parker here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, what wide receiver are we going to sit in week 13? I'm going to sit Travis Fulgham from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Although Travis Fulgham has averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.3 pass targets per game, take a look at his last 3 games. He only scored 4, 2, and 2 fantasy points off of 2, 7, and 5 pass targets. He's projected at 12.4 fantasy points here in week 13, but I don't trust Travis Fulgham with Carson Wentz throwing him the ball. Carson Wentz is off on all of his passes. He just faced the Seattle Seahawks. He had the absolute best possible matchup, and he couldn't do a darn thing with it. So I don't trust Carson Wentz, and I don't trust Travis Fulgham, so I'm going to sit Travis Fulgham here versus the Green Bay Packers. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. So I know I just said that I don't trust Carson Wentz, but I meant Carson Wentz throwing the ball down the field. But those short passes, Carson Wentz can still hit those, so I'm going to start Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Dallas Goedert has averaged 12.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.9 pass targets per game. He scored 21 and 19 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 10 and 6 pass targets. He's projected at 11.2 fantasy points here in week 13. I think he's pretty much all Carson Wentz has left, so I'm going to start Dallas Goedert here versus the Green Bay Packers. Okay, and what tight end are we going to sit here in week 13? I'm going to sit Noah Fant from the Denver Broncos playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Noah Fant has averaged 9.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. But he's only scored 2, 10, and 5 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 5, and 7 pass targets. He's projected at 7.1 fantasy points here in week 13. And in all fairness, he didn't have a quarterback last week, but even with a quarterback at the helm, the Denver Broncos offense just isn't good enough to give Noah Fant the red zone targets. So I'm going to sit Noah Fant here versus the Kansas City Chiefs.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.